Will you come to my school show? I don't have anyone else. The words were soft, almost lost beneath the hum of afternoon traffic and the distant echo of a bouncing basketball on the blacktop. But somehow they landed with a weight that didn't belong to a voice so small. Daniel Whitmore stopped mid-step, one polished shoe still hovering above the concrete walkway outside Lincoln Elementary. His phone pressed to his ear as a voice on the other end continued outlining numbers, projections, deadlines, things that usually filled every inch of his attention. But not now. Not after that. Slowly, he turned. She stood a few feet behind him, no taller than his chest, her dark eyes steady but careful, like she had already prepared herself for disappointment before even asking. Her name, though he didn't know it yet, was Lila Brooks. 8 years old. Her hair was braided neatly into rows, each one slightly uneven like they had been done in a rush or maybe by hands that were tired. She held a wrinkled piece of paper in both hands, the edges folded and unfolded so many times it looked softer than it should have been. An invitation. Daniel lowered his phone, not even realizing he had gone silent. The voice on the other end faded into nothing. For a man who commanded boardrooms and moved markets with a sentence, he suddenly had no words at all. My show is on Friday, she added, her voice still gentle, still trying not to ask for too much. It's important. A breeze passed between them, lifting the corner of her paper and brushing against his tailored coat, carrying with it the faint scent of cafeteria lunches and chalk dust and something else. Something like hope, fragile and stubborn. Daniel glanced down at the invitation in her hands. He could see crayon lettering across the top, bright and uneven, Spring Showcase. Below it, a space that said guest name, left blank. He felt something tighten in his chest, subtle but unfamiliar. Do your parents know you're asking strangers? He said finally, his voice calm, measured, the same tone he used in negotiations, but sounded different here, like it didn't quite belong. Lila didn't look away. My mom works nights, she said simply. And my dad. She paused, not searching for words, just choosing not to finish the sentence. Then she lifted her chin just a little. I asked some of the people already. They were busy. There was no bitterness in it. No akiyasashin. Just a quiet fact. Daniel exhaled slowly. Somewhere behind him, a car door slammed. A group of kids laughed as they ran past, their backpacks bouncing, their voices loud and careless in the way children's voices are supposed to be. Lila didn't turn to look at them. She stayed right where she was, waiting. Not begging, just waiting. Daniel's phone buzzed in his hand again, the screen lighting up with a name that normally would have pulled him back instantly, but he didn't answer. Instead, he looked at her, really looked this time, at the way her fingers gripped that paper like it mattered more than anything, at the way she stood her ground without stepping forward, at the quiet space around her where someone should have already been. It's okay if you can't, she added quickly, almost as if she needed to protect him from the weight of her own question. I just thought maybe. She trailed off, then gave a small nod to herself, like she had already practiced letting go. Daniel felt the moment stretching, holding its breath. For the first time in a long time, there was no schedule in his mind, no numbers, no next move already calculated. Just a question he hadn't expected, and a little girl who had asked it anyway. Somewhere deep, something shifted, small, almost invisible, but real. And for reasons he couldn't explain, Daniel Whitmore didn't walk away. Daniel Whitmore remained still for a moment longer, as if the world around him had quietly stepped back to give space to something neither of them fully understood yet. And then he cleared his throat softly, glancing once more at the small, worn invitation in Lila's hands before shifting his weight and saying, Friday evenings are usually not flexible for me. His voice steady, practiced, the kind of tone that closed deals and ended conversations. But here it sounded almost like he was, reminding himself more than her, and Lila nodded quickly, almost too quickly, like she had expected that answer from the very beginning, her fingers tightening slightly around the paper as she pulled it closer to her chest and said, That is okay, sir, I understand, with a politeness that felt older than she was, and she gave a small step back, not turning away yet, just creating distance, as if she did not want to take up more of his time than she already had, and Daniel watched that step more closely than he intended to, something about it catching in his mind in a way the numbers on his phone never did. And his phone buzzed again, louder this time, persistent, the screen lighting up with the name of his assistant. And he finally lifted it, pressing it back to his ear. Yes, he said, his voice returning to its usual rhythm. I am on my way. And as the voice on the other end began listing the afternoon schedule, he turned slightly, ready to leave, ready to step back into the world where everything made sense. But then he heard it again, not from her this time, but from somewhere inside his own memory, a much younger voice, uncertain, hopeful, asking a question that had once gone unanswered, and he stopped just a fraction of a second, but long enough for the past to catch up with him, and behind him, Lila had already started to turn away, her small sneakers scraping lightly against the pavement as she walked toward the school doors, her shoulders straight, not slumped, not defeated, just quiet, and that quiet stayed with him longer than it should have. Long enough that he found himself turning back, his voice calling out before he had fully decided to speak. Wait. And she stopped immediately, turning back with a look that was not hopeful yet, just attentive, and Daniel took a step toward her this time, closing the distance she had carefully created, his hand lowering slowly from his phone as he said, "What time is it?" And for a second, she did not answer, as if she needed to be sure she heard him correctly. And then she looked down at the invitation, smoothing it with her palm before reading, 6 o'clock, Friday evening, in the school auditorium, and Daniel nodded once, a small, thoughtful motion, his eyes flicking briefly toward the building behind her, then back to her. "Face, and you are performing?" he asked, and she nodded, a little more energy in the movement now. "Yes, sir, it is a dance." And there was something in the way she said it, not excitement exactly, but pride, quiet and steady in Daniel. Exhaled slowly, his mind already pulling in two directions, one toward the structured certainty of his calendar, the other toward something far less defined, something that did not fit into any schedule he had ever built. And he glanced once more at his phone, at the list of commitments waiting for him, and then back at her, standing there with nothing but a folded piece of paper and a question she had already been prepared to lose. And finally he said, "I cannot promise anything," the words. Careful, measured, but not final, not closed, but I will try to rearrange a few things. And Lila blinked, just once, as if she was adjusting to a reality she had not expected to hear, and then she gave a small nod. "That is more than enough, sir," she said softly. And this time, when she turned toward the school doors, there was something slightly different in the way she walked, not faster, not lighter, but steadier, as if something invisible had shifted just enough to carry her forward. And Daniel stood there for another moment, watching her disappear into the building, the door closing gently behind her, and only then did he lift his phone again, his voice quieter now, but more certain than before. "Clear my Friday evening," he said, and on the other end, there was a pause, a surprised silence, before the question came, "Sir, that includes the Whitaker deal," and Daniel looked at the closed school doors, at the place where a small voice had asked him for something no contract ever had, and he replied, without hesitation this time, "Yes, I am aware." The glass doors of Whitmore Tower closed behind Daniel with a soft, seamless hush, sealing him back into a world where everything moved on precision and expectation, where time was measured in minutes and decisions carried numbers far heavier than words. And yet, as he crossed the marble lobby, past the quiet nods of reception staff and the reflection of his own tailored silhouette in polished stone, there was something slightly out of rhythm in the way he moved, something uncalculated. And by the time he stepped into the private elevator, the silence inside it felt different than usual, not empty, but occupied by a voice that did not belong there, small and steady, asking a question that refused to fade. And when the doors opened to the executive floor, the shift was immediate, voices layered over one another, screens glowing, assistants moving quickly with tablets in hand, the controlled chaos of power and motion, and his assistant, Claire, was already walking toward him before he reached his office, her heels precise against the floor, her expression composed but alert. "Sir, the Whitaker representatives moved the call to Friday at 6:30. They insisted it is the only available window," she said. matching his pace without hesitation, and Daniel did not slow. His hand brushing lightly against the glass door as it opened into his office, the skyline stretching wide beyond it. "Then they will have to find another window," he replied, his voice calm. But there was something under it now, something that made Claire pause just slightly before stepping inside behind him. "Sir, this is a 9-figure negotiation," she said carefully, not challenging, just clarifying. And Daniel set his phone down on the desk, the same phone that had dictated every hour of his life for years. And for a moment, he did not look at it. He looked instead at the city beyond the glass, the endless movement, the constant urgency, and he said quieter this time, "I am aware." And Claire watched him, studying the difference, because there was one, subtle but unmistakable. "Would you like me to reschedule or delegate?" she asked, and Daniel turned back, finally meeting her eyes. "Reschedule," he said, and then, after the smallest pause, "If they cannot accommodate, we will proceed without them." And that was not how Daniel Whitmore had built his empire. Not by bending schedules around uncertainty, not by leaving room for something as unpredictable as a school auditorium on a Friday evening. And yet the decision stood firm, without adjustment, and Claire nodded once, already moving to execute it. But as she reached the door, she stopped just briefly. "Is this about something specific?" she asked, not out of curiosity, but out of understanding, because she had worked beside him long enough to know that changes like this did not happen without reason. And Daniel did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting for a fraction of a second to the corner of his desk where a small, almost forgotten object sat, a framed photograph turned slightly away from view. And for the first time in years, he reached for it, lifting it gently, and in the glass reflection, there was a younger version of himself, standing on a small stage, his posture stiff, his expression uncertain, rows of empty chairs behind the camera that had taken the picture, and the memory returned not as noise, but as silence, the kind that lingers long after an event ends. And he set the frame back down with care before saying, "Yes," and nothing more. And Claire did not ask again. She simply nodded and left the room, the door closing softly behind her, and Daniel stood there alone, the city still moving outside, the world still expecting him to operate the same way he always had. But something had already shifted, quietly, without announcement, and miles away, inside a school gymnasium that smelled faintly of polished wood and old curtains, Lila Brooks stood on a marked line on the floor, her sneakers scuffed from practice, her eyes fixed on the far wall as music played softly from a worn speaker, and she moved through the steps again, careful, deliberate, counting under her breath, not for perfection, but for meaning, because every step mattered when there was only one seat in the audience she was hoping would not be empty. And though she did not know it yet, that single seat had already begun to change the course of a man who had never planned to be there at all. The late afternoon sun stretched long across the worn wooden floor of the school gymnasium, casting thin golden lines that moved slowly with time, and Lila Brooks stood just inside one of them, her small frame still, her breathing steady as the music faded once more from the old speaker in the corner, its faint static lingering in the quiet like a soft echo. And for a moment she did not move. She simply stood there, listening to the silence that followed, as if measuring something invisible. Then she looked down at her shoes, turning one foot slightly to adjust the angle the way she had practiced, the rubber sole leaving a faint mark against the polished surface, and she tried again, stepping into the first count with careful precision, 1, 2, 3, 4, her arms lifting just enough, her shoulders relaxing as she remembered the correction her teacher had given her earlier that day. "Do not rush the turn. Let the music catch you." And she nodded to herself as if the voice were still there, guiding her, even though the room was empty now except for her and the distant hum of an air vent. And across the gym, near the folded bleachers, a single chair had been left slightly apart from the others, not by design, just by accident. But Lila's eyes found it anyway, the same way they had every time she practiced, and she imagined it filled, not with a crowd, not with applause, but with one person who would stay until the end. And she held that image quietly, not as a wish, but as something she was choosing to believe in, even if only for a few minutes at a time. And she continued, step after step, her movements growing smoother, more certain, her small hands tracing shapes in the air that only she seemed to understand. And when she missed a beat, she did not stop. She adjusted, kept going because stopping meant thinking. And thinking meant remembering that there had been other names she had written on invitations, other doors she had approached, other answers that had come back with polite smiles and busy schedules. And she had learned quickly that waiting for someone to show up was different from hoping they would. And so she practiced as if the showing up had already been decided, as if the seat was not empty at all, and somewhere across the city, inside a quiet office high above the streets. Daniel Whitmore sat at his desk long after the last meeting had ended, the lights dimmed, slightly as the building settled into evening, and the papers in front of him remained untouched, not because they were unimportant, but because for the first time in a long time, they were not the only thing asking for his attention. And he leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting once more to the photograph he had turned earlier. And this time he did not look away. He let himself see it fully, the small stage, the stiff posture, the empty space that had once felt normal because there had been no reason to expect anything else. And he remembered the sound of polite applause from a teacher, the quick closing of curtains, the way he had walked off that stage, telling himself it did not matter that he did not need anyone to be there. And for years, he had believed that version of the story because it was easier, because it fit into the life he had built, a life where presence was optional and results were everything. And yet now, in the quiet of his office, that memory felt different, not smaller, but clearer. And he reached for his phone again, not to check a schedule, but to confirm something simple, something that did not require negotiation or approval. And he opened the calendar, scrolling to Friday evening, 6 o'clock, and for a moment he just looked at the blank space he had created there, the absence of meetings, the absence of expectations, and it felt unfamiliar, almost uncertain, and yet he did not change it, he did not fill it, he let it remain exactly as it was. And as he set the phone back down, there was a quiet understanding forming, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, that sometimes the most important place to be was not the one that asked the most of you, but the one that simply asked you to show up. And back in the gym, Lila completed her final turn, her foot landing softly, her arms lowering slowly as the imaginary music came to an end, and she stood there just for a second before giving a small, almost invisible nod, as if acknowledging an audience that may or may not be there. And in that quiet moment, with no applause and no one watching, she smiled, not because she was certain of anything, but because she had chosen to be ready anyway. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of early light that slipped through thin curtains and rested gently on worn surfaces without asking permission. And in a small apartment on the third floor of a building that had seen better years, Lila Brooks sat cross-legged on the floor near the window, her school backpack open beside her, the same wrinkled invitation now carefully smoothed and placed on top of her notebooks as if it deserved its own space. And she traced the letters again with her finger, not because she needed to read them, but because she wanted to feel them, to make them real in a way that would last longer than a moment outside a school door. And from the next room, the soft hum of a fan and the distant sound of someone sleeping filled the air, steady and familiar. And Lila moved quietly, used to keeping her world gentle so it would not disturb what little rest her mother could find after long nights of work. And she reached in her bag and pulled out a small pair of dance shoes, their edges slightly worn but carefully kept, and she held them for a second before slipping them on, tying each lace with slow, deliberate care, as if every knot mattered. And when she stood, she did not look in a mirror, there was none nearby. She simply took a small step forward, then another, practicing the opening movement in the narrow space between the couch and the wall, her arms lifting just enough, her body remembering what her mind had repeated so many times. And even here, in a room too small for full turns and too quiet for music, she kept counting under her breath, 1, 2, 3, 4, not missing a beat, not skipping ahead, because somewhere inside her, the belief had settled that the moment would come. And when it did, she would be ready. And across the city, Daniel Whitmore stood in front of a wide closet filled with suits arranged in perfect order. his hand resting lightly on a dark jacket as he considered something that had nothing to do with fabric or presentation. And behind him, his phone rested on a sleek countertop, silent for now, though it had already begun to collect messages from early morning contacts, confirmations, questions, reminders of the world he had always answered to. And yet he had not reached for it. Not immediately. Instead, he adjusted the cuff of his shirt, then paused, his reflection in the mirror holding his gaze a second longer than usual, and there was something unfamiliar in it. Not uncertainty, but awareness, as if he were seeing not just who he was, but where he was expected to be, and where he had chosen to be instead. And when he finally turned away, he did not reach for the most formal jacket. He chose something simpler, still precise, still unmistakably him, but less guarded somehow. And as he stepped into the hallway of his quiet home, the echo of his footsteps felt different, not heavier, not lighter, just more present. And by the time he reached the elevator, his phone had begun to ring again, and he answered this time, his voice calm, yes. And Claire's voice came through immediately, organized, efficient. Sir, Whitaker's team is requesting confirmation again for Friday evening. They are offering to adjust slightly, but they need a response within the hour. And Daniel listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on the closing elevator doors as they reflected a smaller version of himself, contained, framed, and then he said, without hesitation, decline. And there was a pause on the line, not confusion, but acknowledgement of the finality in his tone. Understood, Claire replied, and the call ended. And as the elevator descended, Daniel exhaled slowly, not with relief, not with doubt, but with something quieter, something that did not need to be named. And miles away, Lila finished another careful sequence in her small living room, her foot landing softly against the floor, her arms lowering with control. And she looked once more at the invitation resting on her bag, her eyes steady, her expression calm, and she whispered, barely above a breath, 6 o'clock, as if saying it out loud could anchor it in place. And then she nodded to herself, not because she was certain he would come, but because she had decided that whether he did or not, she would step onto that stage exactly the same way, ready, steady, and unafraid to be seen. By Thursday afternoon, the school felt different, not louder, not quieter, just charged with a kind of anticipation that moved through the hallways in small, almost invisible ways, in the way teachers reminded students to bring costumes, in the way the bulletin board near the front office displayed bright paper stars with names written in marker, and in the way Lila Brooks walked just a little more carefully, as if every step now carried her closer to something she had already decided mattered. And when the final bell rang, she did not rush outside like the others. She turned instead toward the gymnasium, her backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders as she pushed the heavy door open and stepped into the familiar space, the scent of polished wood and faint chalk dust greeting her like it always did. And inside, a few other students were already practicing, their movements uneven, their laughter breaking the quiet in small bursts. But Lila moved. Past them, finding her mark on the floor with quiet certainty, and she began again, 1, 2, 3, for her body following the rhythm she had built piece by piece. And this time, her turns were smoother, her timing more exact, not because she had changed overnight, but because she had stayed with it, because she had chosen not to stop when it felt easier to. And from the far side of the gym, her teacher, Miss Alvarez, watched for a moment before walking over, her arms crossed lightly, her expression thoughtful. You have been staying late every day this week, she said, her voice warm but observant, and Lila nodded, not stopping her movement, just adjusting her step as she answered, I want to get it right. And Miss Alvarez smiled slightly, shaking her head just a little. It is already right, she said gently. Now it just needs to be yours. And Lila paused at that, her arms lowering slowly as she considered the words, and then she nodded once, a small, understanding motion, before starting again, this time with something different, something less careful and more certain, as if she was no longer trying to match something, but to show it. And across the city, Daniel Whitmore sat in the back seat of a quiet car as it moved through late afternoon traffic, the skyline shifting in reflection across the window beside him. And his phone rested in his hand, screen lit with a message thread that continued to grow, updates, concerns, reminders of what had been declined and what still needed attention. And he read them all, not ignoring, not dismissing, but choosing one by one, which mattered now and which did not. And when the car slowed at a light, his gaze drifted outward, catching a glimpse of a small storefront where a group of children stood near the window, one of them holding a costume bag, spinning once on the sidewalk as if testing a movement before a performance. And Daniel watched that for a second longer than necessary, then looked down at his phone. Again, opening his calendar, confirming the same blank space he had created, 6 o'clock Friday evening, and for the first time he added something to it. Not a meeting, not a negotiation, just a single line, typed slowly, school showcase, and he stared at the words for a moment, before locking the screen, as if naming it made it real in a way that could not be undone. And back in the gym, Lila completed another sequence, her foot landing firmly, her arms lifting and lowering with quiet control. And when the music stopped, she did not immediately start again. She stood still, her chest rising and falling gently, and Miss Alvarez stepped closer, placing a light hand on her shoulder. "Who are you dancing for?" she asked softly, and Lila looked toward the empty chair near. The bleachers, the same one her eyes always found. And for a second, she hesitated, not because she did not know the answer, but because saying it made it more real. And then she said, "Someone who said he would try," and Miss Alvarez followed her gaze, then nodded slowly. "Then dance like he already said yes," she replied, and Lila turned back to her spot, her posture straightening just a little more, her expression settling into something calm and steady. And when the music started again, her first step was not careful this time. It was certain, as if somewhere between asking and waiting, she had decided that showing up was not just something she hoped for. It was something she was ready to meet. Friday arrived with a quiet kind of certainty, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but settles into the air like something inevitable. And by late afternoon, Lincoln Elementary had begun to transform in small, careful ways, folding chairs arranged in rows inside the auditorium. A temporary stage set with simple curtains that carried the faint scent of storage and time, and a sign near the entrance written in bright marker that read "Spring Showcase tonight, 6 o'clock," and Lila Brooks stood just behind the stage curtain, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of the fabric as she peeked out at the slowly filling room, her heart steady but aware, counting something invisible not in numbers now, but in moments, and she watched as families entered, parents taking seats, siblings whispering, coats being folded and placed carefully over chair backs. And every time the door opened, her eyes lifted, just for a second, not searching desperately, just checking, just noticing, and then returning to stillness when the figure was not the one she had imagined, and behind her, the low hum of other children preparing filled the space, soft footsteps, quiet voices, the rustle of costumes being adjusted, and Miss Alvarez moved between them with calm reassurance, offering small nods and gentle reminders. "Breathe. Take your time. You already know what to do." And when she reached Lila, she paused for a moment, her hand resting lightly on Lila's shoulder. "You look ready," she said softly, and Lila nodded, her eyes steady. "I am," she replied, not because she knew how the night would unfold, but because she had decided to be. And across the city, Daniel Whitmore stepped out of his car onto a sidewalk that felt unfamiliar not because of the place, but because of the purpose. The school building standing ahead of him, smaller than the structures he was used to entering, its brick walls worn but steady, its windows glowing with warm light that spilled gently into the evening air. And for a moment he did not move forward. He simply stood there, the distant sound of voices and laughter reaching him, faintly, and his phone buzzed once more in his hand, the screen lighting up with another message from Claire, a final update, a last opportunity to reconsider, and he looked at it, not with hesitation, but with clarity, before turning the screen dark and slipping the phone into his pocket. And then he stepped forward, each movement measured not by urgency, but by intention. And as he approached the entrance, a group of parents passed by him, their conversation light, their presence easy, and for the first time, Daniel found himself not outside of that world, but stepping into it, not as a guest of importance, but but simply as someone who had chosen to be there. And inside the auditorium, the lights dimmed slightly as the first announcement came through the speakers, welcoming everyone and asking them to take their seats. And Lila stepped back from the curtain, her breathing slow and even, her hands relaxing at her sides. And she did not look again, not at the door, not at the seats, because she had already made her decision. She would dance whether he was there or not. And that choice settled into her like something solid, something unshakable. And as the first performance began, the room grew quiet, attentive, and the space between moments narrowed, carrying everyone forward. And outside the auditorium doors, Daniel paused once more, his hand resting lightly on the handle. The sound of music faintly audible through the wood, and for a brief second, the past and present seemed to meet in that stillness. The memory of a stage once left unseen, and the reality of one waiting just beyond the door. And then, without hesitation, he pushed it open and stepped inside. The auditorium doors closed softly behind Daniel Whitmore, the sound barely noticeable beneath the gentle swell of music already filling the room. And for a moment he remained near the back, his eyes adjusting not to the light, but to the shift in atmosphere, the quiet focus of families seated shoulder to shoulder, the soft rustle of programs being held in careful hands, the low glow of stage lights casting a warm amber across the curtain. And he moved forward slowly, not wanting to interrupt, not wanting to draw attention, his presence blending into the rows as he found an empty seat near the aisle. And as he sat, he exhaled quietly, as if crossing some invisible threshold he had not fully understood until now. And on stage, a group of children finished their performance to gentle applause, the sound filling the space with something simple and sincere, and Daniel watched it all with a stillness that felt unfamiliar, not analytical, not measured, just present. And as the next name was called over the speaker, his attention sharpened without effort. Next, we have Lila Brooks, and behind the curtain, Lila heard her name clearly, her body responding before her mind could overthink it, her shoulders settling, her hands relaxing at her sides, and she took one steady breath, not searching for the audience, not searching for the door, because she had already made that choice earlier. And when the music began, she stepped forward into the light, the stage welcoming her not, with grandeur, but with space, enough room to move, enough room to be seen. And for a brief second, the brightness softened everything beyond the front row, turning faces into silhouettes, turning the audience into something distant. And that was enough to begin. And she moved in her first step, 1, 2, 3, for her body remembering what it had practiced over and over again, her arms lifting with quiet confidence, her feet landing with care, but not hesitation. And as she continued, something shifted not in the room, but within her, the careful counting fading into rhythm, the practiced movements becoming her own. And in the audience, Daniel leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the small figure at center stage, recognizing her immediately, not by name, but by presence, by the way she held herself with something steady and unspoken. And he felt the moment settle around him, not as an event, but as something personal, something that had reached him long before he arrived. And as Lila moved through her turns, her steps growing more fluid, more certain, she allowed herself just once a single glance beyond the stage lights, not searching, just checking the same way she had before. And this time, the silhouettes were not all the same. One of them was clearer, closer, seated just slightly apart. And though the light blurred the details, she recognized the stillness, the posture, the way he leaned forward just enough. And she did not stop. She did not break her movement, but something inside her shifted, not into surprise, but into confirmation. And her next step landed stronger. Her turn held longer, her arms lifting with a quiet certainty that had not been there before. And in his seat, Daniel did not move, did not look away, because this was not something to observe from a distance. This was something to witness fully. And as the music carried her toward the final sequence, the room seemed to hold its breath, not in tension, but in quiet attention. And when she reached the last movement, her foot landing softly, her arms lowering slowly as the music faded. There was a brief moment of stillness, a pause that stretched just long enough to be felt. And then the applause came, not loud, not overwhelming, but real, steady, filling the space with something warm and undeniable. And Lila stood there for a second, her chest rising gently, her eyes lifting once more toward that same seat. And though she did not wave, did not call out, her small smile said everything she needed it to. And in that moment, Daniel Whitmore realized that showing up had never been about changing her performance. It had been about changing himself. The applause lingered for a few seconds longer than Lila expected, not because it was loud, but because it felt steady, consistent, like something that did not rush to end. And as she stepped back from the center of the stage, her movements calm and controlled, she did not look down or away. She allowed herself one more glance toward the audience, toward that same seat, and this time there was no uncertainty left in her expression, only a quiet acknowledgement. And then she turned, disappearing behind the curtain where the soft hum of voices immediately returned, other children shifting, whispering, preparing for their own moments. And Miss Alvarez was there, waiting, her eyes warm, her smile small but certain. "That was yours," she said gently, echoing her words from the day before, and Lila nodded, not out of excitement, but understanding, her chest still rising from the effort, her hands relaxing at her sides. And for a moment she simply stood there, letting the moment settle, not trying to hold on to it, just letting it exist. And beyond the curtain, the next performance began, the music changing, the audience shifting again into quiet attention. And in his seat, Daniel Whitmore remained still, his hands resting lightly together, his gaze fixed not on the stage now, but on the space where she had been, as if the absence held as much meaning as the presence had. And he did not reach for his phone, did not check the time, because for once, time did not feel like something he needed to manage. It felt like something he was part of. And as the performance continued, he became aware of the small details around him, the way a parent leaned forward in their seat, the way a child in the front row swung their legs gently, the way the lights warmed the edges of the room. And it was all so ordinary, so simple, and yet it carried a kind of weight he had not recognized before. And when the applause rose again for another student, he joined it without hesitation, his hands moving in rhythm with the rest of the room, not as a gesture of politeness, but as something genuine. And when the program reached its end, the final announcement, thanking everyone for attending, the audience began to shift, chairs scraping softly against the floor, voices rising again into conversation. And Daniel stood slowly, not rushing toward the exit, not pulled by the instinct to leave as soon as the purpose had been fulfilled. Instead, he turned toward the side of the stage, toward the place where performers would emerge, and he waited, his posture calm, his expression thoughtful. And after a few minutes, the curtain parted slightly, children beginning to step out in small groups, some running toward waiting families, others walking more slowly, scanning the room for familiar faces. And then Lila appeared, her dance shoes still on, her hair slightly loosened at the edges, her eyes moving across the space with quiet awareness. And when she saw him standing there, not at a distance now, but close enough to be unmistakable, she did not run, did not rush forward. She simply walked toward him with the same steady pace she had carried onto the stage. And when she reached him, she stopped, looking up with that same calm expression. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the moment did not need to be filled immediately. And then Daniel said, his voice softer than it had been when they first met, "You did not miss a single step." And Lila's lips curved slightly, not into a wide smile, but into something small and real. "I practiced," she replied. And he nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense, because it did, because it explained everything that had just happened without needing anything more. And after a brief pause, she asked, "Did you make it on time?" And there was no accusation in her voice, no doubt, just a simple question. And Daniel looked at her, then at the stage behind her, then back again, and he answered, "Yes." And this time, the word carried more than confirmation. It carried presence, and Lila nodded once, accepting it fully, as if that had always been enough. And in that quiet exchange, something settled between them. not as an agreement spoken aloud, but as a shared understanding that sometimes the most important thing someone can do is exactly what they said they would try to do, and actually do it. The hallway outside the auditorium slowly emptied, the echo of footsteps and soft conversations fading into the distance as families gathered their things and made their way toward the parking lot. And under the warm overhead lights, Lila Brooks stood beside Daniel Whitmore with a quiet stillness that did not feel awkward, just new, as if both of them were learning how to exist in the same moment without needing to rush it. And from down the hall, Miss Alvarez approached, her expression bright with quiet pride. "There you are," she said gently, her eyes moving from Lila to Daniel with a brief, curious glance. "You were wonderful tonight." And Lila nodded once, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you." And Miss Alvarez turned to Daniel, offering a polite smile. "You must be her guest," she said. And Daniel inclined his head slightly, his tone respectful. "I am glad I could be here." And there was no need to explain further. No need to add titles or context, because in this space, those things did not carry the same weight, and Miss Alvarez seemed to understand that, nodding once before placing a light hand on Lila's shoulder. "Keep that feeling," she said quietly. "It is yours to keep." And with that, she moved on, leaving them again in a moment that felt simple and unforced. And after a second, Daniel glanced toward the exit, then back at Lila. "Do you have someone waiting for you?" he asked. Not out of assumption, but care, and Lila shook her head gently. "My mom is working tonight," she replied, her tone matter of fact, not heavy, just honest. "She said she will ask me about it in the morning." And Daniel nodded, taking that in, the quiet independence in her voice, the way she carried it without complaint, and for a moment he considered something, not as a business decision, not as a calculated move, but as a natural continuation of the moment they were already in. "Would you like to walk outside?" he asked, and Lila looked toward the doors, then back at him, and nodded. "Okay," and together they stepped out into the evening air, the sky now a deep shade of blue with the first hints of night settling in. The parking lot dotted with cars pulling away, headlights cutting soft lines across the pavement, and they walked side by side without speaking at first, their pace unhurried, matching without effort. And after a few steps, Lila said, quietly, "I thought you might not come." Not as a question, not as a complaint, just as something she had once considered. And Daniel exhaled slowly, looking ahead before answering. "I almost did not," he admitted, his voice calm but honest. And Lila nodded, as if that made sense, because it did, because trying and doing were not always the same thing. And after a moment, she added, "But you did." And there was something in the way she said it, something that closed the space between those two ideas without needing to explain them. And Daniel looked down at her briefly, a small shift in his expression, something softer than before. "Yes," he said again, and they continued walking until they reached the edge of the parking lot, where the glow of a street lamp cast a quiet circle of light around them. And Lila stopped there, turning slightly toward him, her hands resting at her sides. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice clear, not overly emotional, just sincere. And Daniel met her gaze, holding it for a moment before responding, "Thank you for asking." And as the words settled between them, simple and complete, there was a sense that something had changed, not in a dramatic way, not with any grand declaration, but in the kind of way that lasts longer, the kind that stays with you long after the moment has passed. And as a car pulled up slowly near the curb, a neighbor stepping out to wave Lila over, she gave a small nod to Daniel. "That is my ride," she said, and he nodded in return. "Good night, Lila." And she smiled, just slightly, before turning and walking toward the car, her steps steady, her shoulders relaxed. And Daniel remained where he was for a moment longer, watching as she climbed in and the door closed softly behind her. And as the car pulled away, its taillights fading into the night, he stood under the street lamp with a quiet understanding settling into place, that sometimes the smallest invitations carry the greatest weight, and sometimes the most important decision is simply choosing to show up when it matters. The night had settled softly over the neighborhood, the kind of quiet that carried a gentle weight, and Daniel Whitmore remained standing on the sidewalk near the curb, the cool evening air brushing against his face, the glow from the street lamp above casting long, thin shadows that stretched toward the edge of the parking lot. And for a moment he allowed himself to breathe without urgency, without the need to check his phone or attend to the world that always demanded something from him. And as he watched Lila Brooks' car drive away slowly, the red taillights fading into the distance, he realized that the space between asking and arriving had closed, and in that closure, there was something steady and profound, a quiet kind of affirmation that what had begun as a small invitation had become something meaningful for both of them. And he stepped back, adjusting the lapels of his coat, his eyes scanning the empty street for a second, not because he expected anything, but because he wanted to take. In the moment fully before moving on, and across the city, at home, Lila settled carefully on her bed, her dance shoes tucked neatly beside her, her backpack zipped and leaning against the wall, and she ran her fingers lightly over the invitation that had started it all, smoothing the edges once more, not because she needed to reread it, but because it was a reminder of what had already happened, a confirmation of presence, of acknowledgement, and she allowed herself to lean back against the pillows, her chest rising and falling steadily, her mind replaying each movement on the stage, each step measured, each turn precise, and in that replay, the presence of someone she had hoped for, someone she had imagined sitting in the front row, was there, real and steady, and she smiled just slightly, not broadly, but enough to feel the shift, the quiet settling of a nervous energy into calm confidence. And in his office, Daniel opened the blinds slightly, letting the dim street light spill in, a soft glow across the desk scattered with papers that no longer seemed urgent, and he leaned back in his chair, resting his hands lightly in his lap, his gaze not on the documents, not on the numbers, but on the quiet horizon beyond the glass, the same horizon that had carried him toward a decision to show up, to be present in something beyond a schedule. And he thought briefly of the stages he had once stood upon in his youth, the empty seats, the polite applause that had never truly mattered, and now he recognized the difference, the weight of presence over expectation, and he exhaled slowly, a sound almost lost in the large quiet of the office. And back at the school, Lila carefully set the invitation on her nightstand, tucking it beneath her arm for a moment before letting it rest flat. And she closed her eyes, allowing herself to imagine not the audience, not the applause, but the moment of arrival itself. And she felt it in her chest as something warm, steady, affirming, a recognition that her small courage had met someone else's decision. And that intersection had created a space where both of them were changed. And when she finally drifted into sleep, it was with a calm certainty, not that tomorrow would be easy, not that everything would be perfect, but that she had already stepped into a moment where presence and intention had mattered more than anything else. And Daniel, still at his desk, looked once more toward the horizon, knowing that the choice he had made to come, to simply be there, would echo far beyond the simple words of invitation, carrying with it the quiet knowledge that showing up had never been trivial, that small actions can shift worlds, and in that understanding, he allowed himself to settle, to exist fully in the present, aware that both their lives had been quietly, irrevocably altered by the simplest of decisions, the smallest of gestures, and the night carried on around them with a soft, steady calm that promised a tomorrow touched by that quiet, shared understanding. The following morning, sunlight spilled through the thin curtains of Lila Brooks' bedroom, casting long, soft lines across the hardwood floor, and she sat on the edge of her bed, her school uniform neatly folded on a chair beside her, her hands resting lightly on her knees as she thought about the night before, the memory of Daniel Whitmore standing quietly near the stage still vivid in her mind. And she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the heater running in the room, a warmth that came from knowing someone had been there, truly present. And she reached for her dance shoes, running her fingers over the scuffed leather, remembering the careful steps she had taken, the moments when she had turned and lifted her arms with precision, and the knowledge that someone had seen her, had noticed her effort, made every movement feel more meaningful, more complete. And she carefully placed the shoes back on the shelf before standing and walking toward the window, the cool morning air, brushing against her face as she opened it slightly, letting in the sounds of the city. Waking, the faint hum of cars along the street, the soft chatter of children heading to school. And for a moment, she closed her eyes, breathing in, feeling the space around her, the possibilities of a day that no longer felt ordinary, because the night before had shifted something inside her, a quiet understanding that presence and attention could matter more than she had imagined. And across the city, Daniel Whitmore arrived at his office building, the glass doors reflecting the early light. As he stepped inside, his suit jacket fitting with a familiar precision, his shoes clicking softly against the polished marble floors, and he felt the same sense of calm he had discovered on the sidewalk after the performance. A calm that was not the absence of responsibility, but the presence of choice, the knowledge that showing up mattered, not for obligation, not for schedules, but for the small, tangible impact it could create. And as he entered his office, he did not immediately check the phones, the emails, the lists of meetings waiting to be handled. Instead, he paused, looking out the large window at the city stretching below, the sun reflecting off the buildings, the streets slowly coming to life, and he thought of the empty seat he had occupied the night before, the simple act of being present and attentive, and how that had changed the rhythm of a small corner of the world. And in the school gymnasium, Lila had arrived early once more, her backpack slung neatly over her shoulders, and she moved through the quiet hallways, greeting teachers and staff with soft smiles, her steps deliberate, as if carrying the lesson from the night before into the new day. And when she reached the gym, the place already smelled faintly of polished wood and the lingering scent of stage curtains. And she began to warm up, each movement deliberate, her posture straight, her arms lifting and lowering in careful rhythm. And for the first time, she did not imagine the audience as a faceless group, but as individuals, each seat representing presence, attention, and care, and she carried that thought with her through every step, every stretch, every turn. And Daniel, arriving at the school later that morning for a quick check-in, observed from the doorway, quietly, without drawing attention, watching Lila move through her sequence, the precision in her movements, the quiet confidence that had settled over her like a light shield. And he felt a subtle shift in himself, an understanding that the smallest acts, the simple choice to show up, could ripple far beyond the moment. And when Lila finally paused, brushing a strand of hair from her face, she looked toward the door instinctively, and their eyes met briefly, and without words, a shared acknowledgement passed between them. A quiet understanding that the night before had been more than a performance. It had been the start of something meaningful, a connection that neither needed to be announced or explained, and Daniel stepped inside, offering a small, genuine smile, and Lila returned it with one of her own, just as real, just as steady. And for a moment, the gym felt different, not larger, not brighter, but alive in a subtle, lasting way that neither of them would forget. A reminder that sometimes presence, attentiveness, and care could create the kind of change that schedules, meetings, and plans never could. And in that quiet morning light, both of them understood the power of showing up and the importance of small gestures carried with intention. The day settled into a quiet afternoon, sunlight streaming through the tall windows of Lincoln Elementary, spilling golden stripes across the hardwood floor of the empty gymnasium. And Lila Brooks stood near the center, her dance shoes resting neatly on the edge of the stage, the echo of applause from the previous night still alive in her chest, a gentle warmth that made her shoulders lift a little higher and her chest rise steadier. And as she traced her fingers along the worn curtain, smoothing the folds, she remembered every step, every turn, every pause she had taken during the showcase, and the weight of being seen, truly seen, by someone who had chosen to show up, had not left her, settling into her like a quiet affirmation. And Daniel Whitmore, meanwhile, stood outside the school, the cool breeze brushing his face as he looked at the building, the stage where she had performed etched in his mind, the way she moved with confidence that had not depended on anyone else's presence, and he felt a subtle shift in himself, a recognition that being present had meant more than attending a performance. It had meant believing in someone's courage, and across the city, Lila opened her backpack, carefully retrieving the invitation, and held it for a moment, feeling the smooth edges against her fingers. The paper soft for being unfolded and refolded countless times, and she smiled quietly, a small curve of her lips, because it was more than just a note on a page. It was a symbol of something larger, of the moment she had stepped forward and been acknowledged, and she walked slowly toward the edge of the stage, each step deliberate, her toes brushing lightly against the floor, and she stopped, glancing toward the doorway, imagining the silhouette she had seen the night before, calm and steady. And though the auditorium was empty now, she allowed herself a small breath of relief, a moment of quiet pride, for having met the stage with her full attention, and she felt the memory of Daniel's presence like a gentle echo, not intrusive, just affirming, as if his attention had stayed with her even when he was elsewhere. And Daniel, walking through the quiet streets, back toward his car, glanced at the school one last time, a subtle nod to the idea that some gestures, no matter how small, could ripple far beyond the moment. And as he drove away, the city passing quietly by, he thought of Lila, her poise, her quiet courage, and the lesson she had offered without words, that showing up, simply showing up for someone, could create a weightless kind of change, subtle yet profound. And in the gym, Lila stood at the center once more, imagining her family, her mother resting after a long night, herself stepping confidently into a new day, and she knew that the applause, the acknowledgement, the simple act of being noticed had shifted her, had made her feel steadier, stronger, ready for moments to come. And Daniel, arriving at his office later, looked out over the city, the skyline bathed in afternoon light, reflecting on the night before, and he realized that the smallest decisions, the quietest presence, could transform not only those they touched directly, but themselves as well. And in that awareness, both he and Lila carried a shared understanding, unspoken but profound, a recognition of courage met with acknowledgement, of effort met with presence. And as the days stretched onward, sunlight fading softly into evening, that understanding lingered, quiet and persistent, shaping the way they moved, thought, and chose to be, for both of them, forever changed by a simple invitation and the choice to answer it.